Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, their lives, their opinions, and perspectives that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, by profession a seamstress at a downtown Montgomery, Alabama department store, boarded, from the back, a segregated Montgomery City Lines municipal bus. And feeling tired and in bodily pain after a long day at work, she sat down in the first row of the colored section at the back of the bus. When a white man boarded the front of the bus and found the front whites-only section full, the bus driver told everyone in Ms. Parks' colored section to get up and move back. Others complied, but Rosa Parks refused and was promptly arrested and found guilty 4 days later of violating Montgomery's segregation laws. And the courageous defiance and arrest of this so-called ordinary black woman at once made history by kickstarting a bus boycott that lasted 381 days, giving birth to the modern civil rights movement, sparking the push for racial equality, bringing superstars such as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. into the public eye, and subsequently changing the world forever. Our common cultural practice is to remember Rosa Parks only as a demure and delicate old seamstress whose moment in history began on that Montgomery bus 69 years ago. But Rosa Parks did so much more than just sit on a bus. In fact, Rosa Parks had already left us a deliberate legacy of her own activism. She had a history even then as a civil rights campaigner, even back when Dr. Martin Luther King was still in high school. Rosa Parks also stands at the intersection of the continued racism and sexism that, of course, she faced all of her life. And on this edition of Then There's California, as we celebrate Black History Month here in February 2024, and being a few days beyond our annual commemoration of Rosa Parks Day on her birthday, February 4th, we'll share stories with one of the two African-American members of the state Senate about the steely grace and strategic intellect and indomitable spirit of Rosa Parks, and the disservice that we do to Ms. Parks by confining her memory to that moment on that Montgomery bus. I always covet the opportunity to break conversational bread with State Senator Lola Smallwood-Cuevas, who represents Southern California's 28th Senate District, which includes a large part of downtown Los Angeles and South LA and West LA. Senator Smallwood-Cuevas is also the newly appointed chair of the Senate Labor, Employment, and Retirement Committee. Senator Smallwood-Cuevas is an educator, a labor organizer, a community leader, a former journalist. Senator Smallwood-Cuevas last joined us in the summer of 2023 last year, along with her Legislative Black Caucus colleague, Senator Stephen Bradford, in an expansive conversation about the then just released final report of the California Reparations Task Force. And we're glad to have her back now. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's always an honor to be here with you.
How are you?
I'm doing well. We're just kicking off the second session. This is my second year, and so I have hit the ground running. I always say it's a treadmill that's on high, and you jump on it, and you just get on it and keep moving and pushing, but it's an exciting year. We've got some challenges in terms of our budget deficit. We see that there are some pretty serious cuts being proposed. So we just have to be very vigilant in making sure that through this process, we protect the progress that we've made in California, particularly around housing our unhoused communities, particularly around making sure that workers are protected in the workplace, making sure that we are doing all that we can to build a climate resilient future for California. So we just have to keep our eye on the prize. Like Sister Rosa Parks told us, keep our eye on the prize. So that's what we're about, and that's what we're going to be doing this year. So it's just great to be here and to talk about this amazing woman.
Well, thank you for that perfect transition into this conversation. As I mentioned, we're in Black History Month. Yeah, let's talk about Rosa Parks. I would say that even someone with just a cursory knowledge of the story of Rosa Parks being arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 understands what an act of courage and defiance that was against this overwhelming rule of segregation throughout particularly the South, but throughout really the United States at that time. What does Rosa Parks mean to you? A black woman negotiating all of this caste system there in the South, and then this courageous move that she made. What does she mean to you?
She means transformation. And it's one of those stories that reminds us that ordinary people do the extraordinary things that make a difference for generations to come. And I think about Rosa Parks being a seamstress. My great-grandmother was a seamstress. She was a garment worker, but she was a woman who did not take no for an answer. She was a woman who stood up for herself in her workplace. My great-grandmother went on to open her own business and to be a leader in her neighborhood council, and taught me that no matter where you come from, no matter what your education level, no matter who other people say you are, you have the opportunity and the power to make a difference for yourself and for your community. And I think when I think of Rosa Parks, I think about Naomi. I think about my great-grandmother. So, for me, learning the story of this very quiet woman who sat down and stood up for so many of us, it reminds me that Rosa Parks wasn't just that woman sitting on the bus. We see that image, right? We see that picture, that frame, but she was a warrior. She was a champion for social justice, for civil rights, for humanity. She studied at the Highlander Center, which is a place where civil rights leaders go to build their skills to understand nonviolent movements. She worked as secretary of the NAACP for many years, and she really came into that leadership role in the NAACP doing work, actually interviewing Black women who had been sexually assaulted by law enforcement and beginning to tell those stories of sexual violence against Black women in the Deep South. She had a love for youth and spent a lot of her time working with young students and educating them on nonviolence and why civil rights is important, and helping to build, as we know, a tremendous youth movement in the civil rights movement in the South. The student walkouts, the sit-in and the counter movement. So Rosa Parks, in her very quiet way, had, working back from that image, had been a fighter on the ground and was selected because of her skills at strategy, her skill at nonviolence technique, to actually be the one to sit in that seat. So we see Rosa, but she was an ordinary woman who built extraordinary skill and was chosen to really send the first shot over the bow in terms of the civil rights revolution. She was selected to do that. So I am always inspired by her story, by her work, but also by the seriousness that she took justice, that this was a serious business for her, and that she did all that she could to sharpen her saw to be able to be the tool that we needed her to be in the movement. And we have to say that for every woman. I think about my predecessors, Holly Mitchell. I think about Karen Bass. I think about Maxine Waters. I think about my colleagues who, in that spirit, have sharpened their saw to be excellent for communities and to be warriors for the communities that need them the most. So I'm honored to be a part of that legacy and that history.
And sharpen the saw is a great metaphor. In fact, Rosa Parks was only 42 years old. We have this image of this elderly, demure woman, but she was young. And actually, she was very calculating. From what I've read, she actually got on that bus because she was not the first one to be arrested, but the one that checked all the boxes, so to speak, with the boycott committee and who would be out there to represent. But she got on that bus kind of hoping she'd be arrested.
That was the strategy.
Yeah.
That was the goal. The intention was to ignite a movement and to have leaders who could articulate the struggle, who could inspire the community to take action. Because Rosa's sitting down meant that thousands of Black domestic workers would have to walk. They would have to walk to work. And there was a whole system of drivers, a whole system of folks who prepared breakfast for those women who would have to get up 4 hours earlier to walk or be in some kind of auto lottery to get to the houses that they worked in. And so this was a battle. And Rosa was one of the lieutenants in the battle, and enormous number of foot soldiers, ordinary families, domestic workers, housewives, pastors, children, teens, all galvanized behind that effort. So I think we can never underestimate the ordinary folks, everyday folks in our communities who are armed with extraordinary understanding and strategy to make a difference in communities. I represent the 28th District. The 28th District is home to civil rights leaders like Reverend James Lawson, who's one of my mentors. There are hundreds of nonprofit, faith-based community organizations that are dedicated to social justice, to being the, I want to say, statisticians is the word, of how to bring about change in communities. And so that legacy of organization didn't start today. It started with women like Rosa Parks and that movement over 60 years ago. And so, yeah, when you think about Rosa, she didn't volunteer. She was drafted, and she knew exactly what her role was to be. She knew exactly what her message needed to be, and she was able to bring so many folks, including the Montgomery Improvement Association, to recognize that they needed to make a change and they needed to do something different. And that's the power of nonviolence. It's liberating the oppressed, but also liberating the oppressor. And Rosa was definitely a leader who could do that.
Do you think we risk in our contemporary study of past history and the legend that Rosa Parks has become to some degree to make sure we don't confine our memory of just that moment in history? Because in some ways, by doing that, we erase part of her character.
We tend to, in this country, we tend to not value our history and to learn from it and to treasure it. We like to sanitize the image of these leaders in a way that removes all of the power that they bring. You know, when you think about Dr. King and his image and how it's used, J. Edgar Hoover said he was the most dangerous man in America, but now he's this very benign image that has been so commercialized. Rosa Parks, we have to remember the struggle and the level of resistance and breaking laws because the laws were immoral. They were lawbreakers. They were breaking laws because the laws were immoral. And I think these are the lessons that we have to hold. When we have a situation where Black women earn 52 cents on a dollar that every white man earns in 2024, Latinas earning 42 cents on a dollar that every white man earns in California in 2024. Those are immoral statistics, and they have been perpetuated by immoral laws that go back to the days of Rosa Parks, do you see? Mm-hmm. And so we have to be vigilant in saying that we need real living wage laws. We need real parity and equity. And we need to know the difference between equality and equity. In Dr. King's time, the feeling was we could get to equality, but now there's been so much compounded poverty, compounded barriers, complex systems that there's not enough, even if communities like Black women, for example, who are the poorest population in the state of California, the poorest.
Yes.
One, because unlike even immigrant and undocumented communities, they have one income in their home, not multiple sources of income. So when we still have statistics where Black women are the poorest population in California, we have to recognize that we remain vigilant in changing laws and conditions that create and perpetuate those situations and those circumstances. And we have to be like Rosa. We have to stand up on these issues and be very vocal and educating our folks that don't get it, our folks who are perpetuating policies that marginalize communities. We have to educate and say, no, there can be a better way. And when we improve the conditions of the poorest population of Black women, we lift all of California in that process, because when you lift the bottom, everything on top has to elevate.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what is so important to remember. It's not the very benign and, whitewashed image of these civil rights leaders, but the radicals, the revolutionaries that they were, and how they exploded laws that were immoral and that created an America that was not being true to the content of its character and its true values of liberty and justice. So I hold that in my heart every day. And I know my constituents, I have so many constituents who are individuals, who are organizers, who are neighborhood council members, block club leaders, to grassroots and grass tops leaders who understand how important this struggle is and how women like Rosa teach us valuable lessons that inspire and help us to keep our eye on the prize.
I so much appreciate you creating that through line between the treading of this tightrope of Jim Crow and the risks that Rosa Parks took at this intersection really of racism and sexism and the challenges she faced all the way to contemporary times. She took a huge risk even after the bus boycott was over. She lost her job as a seamstress. She couldn't get a job, really a decade of economic hardship. Her husband was a barber at a military base. He lost his job. They couldn't get a job in Montgomery. They couldn't get a job in Detroit when they moved. It was a lot of hardship, even though she was looked at as a hero of this movement. So I think it's really important that you bring up this connection between the struggles of pay equity that women of color are dealing with here circa 2024, that Rosa Parks even was experiencing with all of Jim Crow and the segregation laws even back then.
That's right. And my bill, and I want to say I'm so proud that the governor signed my bill, SB 497, which is about anti-retaliation, because even as women take advantage of laws that protect them against sexual harassment in the workplace or against wage theft, employers would retaliate against them. So they would access the laws, and as soon as they filed a claim and complaint, they would be fired. Like Rosa, they would be transferred hours away from their posts. They would be marginalized and isolated in communities. And so my bill was about addressing that kind of retaliation. So I say that to say standing up for yourself, standing up for the state, it does take risk. It takes courage, and we have to show courage, but we also have to protect those who are taking the courage to say how I am being treated is not right. And in order for this system to work, we all have to have fair access and fair opportunity and to be treated fairly. It does take risk, but I'm grateful that the state of California is standing behind workers to say we pass these laws for a reason because we want people to use them, because we want to raise standards where people work and live. But at the same time, we have to ensure that we are educating workers, our young students, our single moms, our most vulnerable populations. We have to let them know that they are powerful, that they do matter, that their lives have worth. As great civil rights leader Jesse Jackson would say, you are somebody. And that means that you have access to your full right, worth, to be able to exercise every law that protects you and to do it with dignity and respect, because it will change conditions, not just for yourself, but for everyone. That's what California is about. That's what we are fighting for every day. That's why celebrating Black History Month, and I really appreciating you dedicating this time to the life of Rosa Parks, because too often we don't have enough examples of that level of courage, who put their personal risk behind the uplift and the advancement of all. And I'm honored to come from that legacy, a legacy of Black mass movement, of freedom movements. I'm very proud of that history, and we know it lives on today, and we see it every day here in this Capitol, and I'm so grateful for that, the past and the present.
I know the movement over the years, over the generations, the decades, has not come without a lot of cost, has not come without a lot of conflict, even amongst your sisters, your white sisters, who have been looking for equality and fairness. I recently read this absolutely fascinating history about the National Organization for Women in the 60s and 70s and all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into creating and maintaining this organization and fighting the misogynism and the discrimination socially and economically. And while Black women were encouraged to join now, many of them did, including one who they actually had a Black woman, Aileen Hernandez, who was president. And they had still this difficulty of getting the white women in now to understand the struggles that women of color, Black women, uniquely had. And many of the white women, particularly the leaders, just had no ideas of the struggles that they faced. Affordable housing, equity, the end of sterilization. And ERA, which was their singular focus for many years, was important, but they just seemed uninterested or even hostile to this idea that they could be perpetrators of that bias that Black women face just by ignoring some of those priorities for Black women. Obviously, we're still perhaps fighting that tension here today. Is that correct?
Well, I say you scratch every modern issue and you'll find a slave era. And go back to Ain't I a Woman, Sojourner Truth. Go back to Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony. And there's a long history of that debate. The truth is, and this is what is why racism is so insidious and insanity, because you really don't understand a person's experience until you've lived it. You don't understand, you talk about mass sterilization. How about breeding plantations? You can't understand the proximity of the Black female slave and the white woman in the house. These are the, sad to say, but these are the sinful roots. And though we understand what progress looks like, it's very different because the experiences are so uniquely different and also polarized. And, you know, that is where, in my experience, this notion of understanding intersectionality, understanding how race and gender, how sexism and racism create a different type of oppression than maybe a white woman in the ERA movement experiencing. And so this is where conversation, this is where understanding that disparity exists. And this is where we have to learn from our history. And as I say, as you see now, we can't even get a good African-American AP class across the country approved because there is an intentional effort to distort history so that we don't understand the intersections and then the difference and how we have to be radical allies, which means I don't have to fully agree or understand because I can never fully understand your experience, but I believe your truth. And here is where we come together and work together. So, you know, white women, when we talk about the spectrum, well, they're earning 80 cents on the dollar compared to the 50 and the 42.
Right.
So even when you look at the economic terms, again, the experience is different. And unless you're in it, you don't fully understand conversation, education, building coalition, because at the end of the day, we're fighting the same forces, but how they impact us may be different, but they're the same forces. So how do we come together and understand the goal is to undermine the forces that perpetuate sexism, that perpetuate racism, that perpetuate homophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim. How do we deal with those forces? How do we make sure we remove those elements from our public policies that create the similar impacts across these impacted and marginalized communities, and do the work where we got to get into the nuance, you know, where something is going to impact Black women different from white women or API or Latina, that we have enough respect and enough communication and knowledge to be able to move policies that can be more surgical in protecting the disparities within disparities and exploding those. That's why caucuses are so important. They're so necessary. They're not divisive. These are tools of education and unity because we begin to understand how every single policy has very unique impacts, and how do we build enough knowledge to build policies that create more of a fix for more of us to address those very unique circumstances. So I'm grateful to Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement and the affirmative action movements. And now we're in the backlash of some of those movements that want to say we are in a race-neutral, gender-neutral society. We know that's not true. And we need to lean on our caucuses. We need to lean on our bases of knowledge to help us build policies that really create the uplift and the fix that help to reverse so much of the crisis that we have and exists here in the state. So I appreciate that question because there's nothing new under the sun, and all of our challenges now are a result of our beginning. And we're still 500 years later,
Yes.
You know, look at reparations, here we are. We're still trying to correct those wrongs. Because if we can do that, if we can get to some of the root cause, then we can really be able to address the multitude of crises that are facing us, which unfortunately live in this issue of disparity, lives within this issue of racial and gender violence and discrimination.
Everything you're saying here, so thought-provoking. To just a final point, how the legend, the memory of Rosa Parks and the movement, the bus boycott, the civil rights movement, will stand the test of time, considering everything that you are talking about, pushing against these memories and pushing against this learning.
Every generation gets stronger and wiser. And I think we could look at the civil rights movement at the turn of the 20th century, and then we could look at the Black Lives Matter movement at the turn of the 21st century and recognize that our work continues because we have done the work of educating. Our communities have done the work of sharing story and narrative and instilling a sense of justice in our young folk and in our community. And I also believe that in our state legislature in particular, there's just been tremendous efforts that have been done as we are seeing some of our first, I think, outgoing pro tem in the Senate. We have first that are still amongst us who are fighting against similar oppressions and representing a new voice and a new way and an alternative. So I'm grateful that California is a place where those voices are alive and well, where those values are a force to reckon with, and where we are keeping that history of Rosa Parks and all of the allies who stood with the civil rights movement to say, this is the America we want. This is the America we believe that is sustainable to grow and to be a leader in the future. So it is our responsibility, it is my responsibility to continue that history, to continue to build the future history where we look back and say, look at how we got over and look at how different our society is, and to resist in an formidable way every effort that is underway to roll us back to a 19th, 20th century America. We have to resist with every ounce of our being. And as we approach 2024, we have to hold the legacy of the civil rights movement close to our vests and have it feed us and inspire us and unify us in justice and equality for everyone in the state and in the country.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this, for your thoughtfulness. I appreciate always having the chance to talk to you about these and other issues, and look forward to the chance we can do it again. So
thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Glad to have you here. State Senator Lola Smallwood-Cuevas, who represents Southern California's 28th Senate District, a member of the Legislative Black Caucus here in Black History Month in February. That closes this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from John Roman, Ben Abaya, Michelle Baker, McClenna Woods, Marvin Richardson, Ariana Medell, Jeff Walters, and the graphic design artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.